At 22:15 hours Eastern Time on the 13th of July, 2026, no press briefing, no satellite phone call from the Pentagon, no warning shot broadcast on live television, just a single line dropped onto the U.S. Central Command public feed, and half a world away, in the suffocating humidity of the Persian Gulf, Iranian air defense batteries are already going through emergency startup sequences, trying to understand what just hit them. This was not an isolated strike. This was Wave 3 of a sustained, multi-night American air campaign against Iranian military infrastructure. And the men and women running those Iranian radar stations already know it will not be the last. To understand how the world arrived at this moment, at this particular CENTCOM post, at this particular hour, you have to rewind the clock 5 months and understand the sequence of decisions, miscalculations, and retaliations that turned the world's most important oil choke point into a war zone. At 3 hours local time on February 28th, the opening shots of this conflict came not from a single platform but from a coordinated, multi-axis air campaign. Israel and the United States launched a joint strike operation against Iran, the culmination of 18 months of failed nuclear negotiations in Geneva, and a direct follow-on to a shorter, 12-day air conflict the year before that had left both sides unsatisfied. The planning for this operation had been running in parallel to the diplomatic track for months. When the talks collapsed for the final time, the targeting packages were already finalized. What followed was the slow-motion destruction of the world's most critical maritime choke point. The Strait of Hormuz, 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, is not just a geographic feature. It is the jugular vein of the global energy system. Before the war began, approximately 27% of the world's entire seaborne crude oil and petroleum products moved through that narrow corridor every single day, roughly 17 million barrels. Every tanker from Kuwait, every LNG carrier from Qatar, every crude shipment from the UAE, all of it, funneled through a gap of water so narrow that two opposing lanes of maritime traffic have to be separated by a 2-mile median zone just to keep ships from colliding in the dark. At 6:30 hours local time on March 4th, Iranian forces declared the strait closed, not threatened, not restricted, closed. Within 72 hours, the UK Maritime Trade Operations Centre, the body that monitors commercial shipping across the entire Indo-Pacific and Gulf region, had logged more than a dozen confirmed attacks on transiting vessels. 5 crew members were dead across 2 ships. The IRGC Navy began deploying contact mines in the Strait's shipping lanes, an act of maritime warfare not seen in these waters since the tanker war of the 1980s. Armed Revolutionary Guard speedboats operating in swarms approached and boarded merchant vessels. Tehran announced the waterway was formally closed to any ship with commercial or governmental ties to the United States, Israel, or their allies. To understand the military instrument Iran is wielding, you need to understand its structure. Tehran does not operate a single unified navy. It runs 2 parallel, ideologically distinct naval forces that share the same waters but answer to entirely different chains of command. The first is the regular Artesh, Iran's conventional military, with its own naval arm, the Islamic Republic of Iran Navy, or IRIN, operating frigates, submarines, and long-range platforms in the Gulf of Oman and beyond. The second is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, an entirely separate force, ideologically loyal to the supreme leader rather than to the state apparatus. Equipped with fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, drones, and swarm tactics optimized specifically for the shallow, cluttered waters of the Persian Gulf. Since a 2007 reorganization, the IRGCN holds sole operational responsibility for the Persian Gulf itself, while the IRIN operates further out in deeper water. Both forces maintain overlapping jurisdiction over the strait, each running its own command centers, its own bases along the coastline, its own engagement protocols. Analysts assessing Iran's response to the American campaign have consistently flagged this split command architecture as the source of Tehran's tactical pattern: fast, aggressive, dangerous, but erratic. Decisions made by IRGC commanders on the water are sometimes not coordinated with IRIN headquarters, and vice versa. The result is a force that is simultaneously capable of sophisticated multi-domain operations and prone to dangerous operational miscommunication. By mid-April, Washington had established its own naval blockade of Iranian ports, a counter-squeeze designed to choke Iran's economy from the opposite direction while Iranian forces choked the strait from theirs. U.S. Navy surface combatants and maritime patrol aircraft enforced a cordon around Iran's major export terminals, including Karg Island, the hub through which approximately 90% of Iran's crude oil exports move. Iranian oil tankers attempting to leave were intercepted and turned back. The economic pressure was immediate and severe. After 6 weeks of this mutual strangulation, both sides reached the same conclusion simultaneously. Neither could sustain the current operational tempo indefinitely. At 14 hours local time on June 17th, President Trump and Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian signed a memorandum of understanding to end the war and lift both blockades. It was, on paper, the beginning of de-escalation. 2 days later, a linked ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah was formally announced. The oil markets surged in relief. Brent crude dropped $11 in a single session. Shipping companies began cautiously rerouting vessels back through the strait. The nightmare appeared to be ending. It wasn't. Israel continued conducting airstrikes against targets in southern Lebanon, citing active Hezbollah military infrastructure that it argued was not covered under the ceasefire terms. Tehran called this a material violation of the June 17th agreement. The IRGC, without waiting for a formal government decision, began restricting traffic through the strait again. The U.S. Navy disputed Iran's legal interpretation. The argument went nowhere. At 9:45 hours Eastern on June 27th, the Pentagon's Joint Maritime Information Center issued a new navigational advisory announcing a widened commercial shipping corridor running near Omani territorial waters, bypassing Iranian-controlled sections of the strait entirely. The corridor was presented publicly as a practical safety measure. Tehran's military leadership read it as something else entirely, a direct operational challenge to Iran's claim of jurisdictional control over the waterway. Everyone in the room understood what it meant. The fragile truce survived 11 more days. At 4:30 hours on July 8th, the interim ceasefire died before dawn. IRGC fast attack craft operating in coordinated swarms struck multiple commercial vessels, transiting the strait in the pre-dawn darkness, a tactic designed to exploit the degraded visual detection capabilities of the family. Overnight watch. 3 ships were struck, 2 sustained hull damage, 1 lost engine power and had to be towed. The U.S. Treasury Department's response came within hours, and it was as consequential as any missile strike. Treasury formally revoked the 60-day sanctions waiver on Iranian oil that had been granted under the ceasefire terms, immediately re-exposing all buyers of Iranian crude to secondary sanctions enforcement. The financial trigger landed like a depth charge on global energy markets. Within hours of the announcement, Brent crude spiked more than 3%, jumping back above $76 a barrel and erasing weeks of carefully negotiated market stabilization. Iran's Persian Gulf Strait Authority issued a blunt written warning to the international shipping community. Any vessel transiting via unauthorized routes would not be covered by safe passage guarantees. The language was deliberately ambiguous. It needed to be. What followed was retaliation on top of retaliation, an escalation cycle with no natural stopping point and no agreed-upon circuit breaker. At 4:47 hours local time on July 12th, the IRGC Navy formally declared the strait closed for the second time. Simultaneously, its surface units issued warning fire at a vessel attempting an unauthorized crossing, a maneuver that, under normal conditions, constitutes a hostile act under international maritime law. But the warning fire was not the main event that morning. At approximately 6:15 local time, CENTCOM publicly accused Iran of directly striking the Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy, a 180-meter vessel transiting the strait's eastern shipping lane on a route to Fujairah. The strike tore into the GFS Galaxy's engine room, disabling all propulsion. The ship went dead in the water inside the strait, one of the worst-case scenarios for any vessel in that corridor. All 11 Indian crew members aboard made the decision to abandon ship, descending into a single lifeboat in the pre-dawn darkness with Iranian vessels still active in the surrounding water. 10 were rescued by coalition maritime assets responding to the distress signal. The 11th, a 34-year-old man from Pune, was not found. 2 days later, the Royal Navy of Oman recovered his body from the water. He was confirmed dead. At 8:30 hours Eastern Time on July 12th, CENTCOM's response was immediate, overwhelming, and multi-domain. American strike aircraft operating from carrier air wings and forward-deployed land bases executed a coordinated, simultaneous strike on hundreds of targets across Iran in a single operational sweep. The targeting packages had been built over months and refined continuously as the conflict evolved. Missile batteries covering the strait's eastern approaches, air defense nodes protecting key coastal positions, IRGC fast attack boat pens at forward operating positions, command and control nodes linking the IRGC's coastal strike capability. The objective was not symbolic. It was the systematic degradation of Iran's operational capacity to threaten commercial shipping. Brent crude jumped more than 4% on the news, reaching nearly $79 a barrel, its highest point in weeks, as markets absorbed the implication that this conflict was not de-escalating but accelerating. Washington's follow-on strikes hit Iranian missile batteries, air defense radar and engagement systems, and IRGC fast attack boat facilities at multiple points around the strait, including hardened military positions on Qeshm Island, a long, narrow landmass that Iran has used for decades as a forward naval operating base, positioned directly inside the strait's chokepoint. Iranian state media confirmed that a Navy Lieutenant Hamidreza Degani had been killed at the southern port of Jask. The Maritime intelligence picture told its own operational story. The tracking platform Windward, which aggregates AIS transponder data, satellite imagery, and radar cross-referencing to monitor global vessel movements in near real time, reported that only 6 vessels crossed the strait in a single overnight window during mid-July. 6. In the weeks prior, during the brief ceasefire, daily crossing counts had run between 18 and 22 transits per 24-hour period. The corridor that carries approximately 20% of the world's entire liquefied natural gas supply and roughly a quarter of its seaborne crude was operating at less than a third of its normal throughput. Tehran did not wait. The IRGC launched 2 cruise missiles at Emirati tankers operating inside the strait's southern shipping lane inside Omani territorial waters. The targets were the Mombasa and the Al Bahia, both UAE-flagged crude carriers. 1 Indian crew member aboard the Mombasa was killed in the strike. 8 more were injured. Both hulls caught fire. The UAE Defense Ministry raised its national forces to the highest level of readiness. Bahrain, home to the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters and the nerve center of American naval operations across the entire Gulf region, activated its missile alert sirens before sunrise. Coalition air defense systems across the eastern Arabian Peninsula went to active engagement posture. The American response was a sustained, 5-hour strike mission, hitting Iranian coastal defense batteries, missile launch facilities, drone storage and launch sites, and maritime strike capability platforms concentrated along the Gulf coastline. When the markets opened in London, Brent crude had climbed to $85 a barrel. WTI was trading near $80. Maritime traffic through the strait kept collapsing. By mid-July, confirmed vessel crossings were down 52% week-on-week. What remained of commercial shipping traffic had begun rerouting defensively, hugging the UAE coastline near Khor Fakkan, adding days to voyage times and tens of thousands of dollars in fuel costs per transit. The first American strike package on day 5 launched at 6 hours Eastern and completed its mission by 7:30. 90 minutes of sustained precision fire targeted coastal defense systems and cruise missile storage and launch sites on Greater Tumb Island, a small, heavily fortified strip of rock, antenna arrays, and radar installations positioned at the strait's western choke point. Analysts have described Greater Tumb, along with its sister island Abu Musa, as critical nodes in what they call Iran's arch defense, a layered, overlapping network of anti-ship missile coverage, radar pickets, and fast attack boat staging areas that together give Tehran the ability to threaten almost any vessel attempting to transit the strait. At 15 hours Eastern, CENTCOM launched a second wave the same day. The target set expanded: Iranian command centers, air defense engagement control systems, missile and drone operational capabilities, coastal surveillance radar facilities. Precision munitions landed at multiple locations across southern Iran, including Bandar Abbas, Iran's largest and most strategically significant naval base on the Persian Gulf, where the IRGC concentrates its primary surface fleet, its submarine docking facilities, and its missile boat squadrons. Iranian state media reported explosion sequences rolling across the south of the country. Bandar Abbas, Keshm, Hengam, Sirik, and Bushehr, with air defense batteries lighting up over each location in sequence as the strike packages worked through their target lists. President Trump was reported to be actively weighing whether to expand the scope of the operation beyond military targets. At sea, the U.S. Navy was no longer just striking targets, it was choking Iran's economic lifeline. American surface combatants intercepted and disabled an empty oil tanker sailing toward Karg Island, Iran's primary crude oil export terminal, located in the northern Persian Gulf, through which the overwhelming majority of Iran's petroleum revenues flow. Trump had briefly floated the concept of imposing a 20% transit toll on all vessels using the strait, a proposal that drew immediate international condemnation and legal challenges from maritime law experts. He backed away from the toll. He replaced it with something blunter: the full reinstatement of the naval blockade that had been suspended under the June ceasefire terms. Tehran's skyline registered the pressure before dawn. Iranian air defense systems activated over the capital, a sign that American strike packages were operating close enough to the heartland of Iran to trigger metropolitan air defense responses. Iranian authorities released their own casualty assessment: more than 30 civilians killed across southern Iran, with over 260 people injured in the strikes, including at least 3 women and 6 children. These figures originated with Iranian government sources and have not been independently verified by Western news organizations with reporters on the ground. But they are the numbers now driving diplomatic pressure on both sides, regardless of their verified accuracy. Iran's counter-narrative pushed hard on its own strike claims. The IRGC announced it had inflicted significant damage on the U.S. Navy's 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, hitting support buildings, fuel storage tanks, and logistics infrastructure. It claimed to have destroyed hardened aircraft shelters housing US F-15, F-16, and F-35 fighters at regional air bases, as well as several MQ-9 Reaper drone platforms. CENTCOM confirmed none of these claims. Meanwhile, Jordan's military intercepted and shot down 3 Iranian ballistic missiles that entered Jordanian airspace before dawn. 3 different countries now directly engaged in the same morning's fighting. This was no longer a bilateral conflict, it had become a regional war. The message from the White House was direct. Speaking to Fox News, Trump said the campaign would intensify rather than ease. He described potential next targets: power plants, bridges, and infrastructure Iran could not easily or quickly rebuild. Standing at the NATO summit in Turkey days earlier, he had already formally declared the ceasefire over and dismissed further diplomatic engagement with Tehran as pointless. On a subsequent day, he was even more direct. American strikes on Iran would continue until, in his words, he personally decided they were done. Former CENTCOM Deputy Commander Vice Admiral Robert Harward went further in broadcast appearances, arguing that the cumulative effect of American strikes had effectively hollowed out Iran's remaining offensive military capacity. The IRGC, he said, was not even a paper tiger anymore. He argued the strike campaign was not merely destroying existing weapons platforms, it was destroying the industrial and logistical infrastructure that would be needed to rebuild them. Not every analyst agreed. Energy economist Brian Medlock offered a more calibrated read of the targeting patterns, describing the tanker strikes in particular as deliberately narrow-hitting vessels used as direct threats to commercial shipping, specifically, rather than the power grid or civilian refining infrastructure. His interpretation: Washington was still trying to keep the pressure surgical, avoiding the kind of full infrastructure campaign that Trump had threatened publicly, and that would almost certainly trigger a broader regional escalation no one had a plan to contain. Even in the middle of an active, multi-day strike campaign, threads of diplomacy persisted. Trump publicly claimed that Tehran had made contact, expressing interest in renewed talks. Iran's foreign ministry publicly denied any such outreach, calling the claim fabricated. In a quiet, unannounced gesture that diplomacy watchers noted carefully, Iran released an American citizen later identified as Dena Karari, who had been detained in Iran since December 2024. Her release was not accompanied by any public statement from either government. Iran's foreign minister traveled to Doha for a state ceremony. Whether back-channel communications occurred on the margins of that visit remains unconfirmed by either party. Analysts are not optimistic. One senior Gulf security expert articulated the core strategic problem with blunt precision, without a clearly defined endgame, a specific, achievable condition that Washington would accept as sufficient to end the campaign. The United States cannot force the strait permanently open without committing to an operational tempo. The American public will not indefinitely sustain. And a full campaign against Iran's civilian and industrial infrastructure risks triggering IRGC retaliatory strikes against energy infrastructure across the entire Gulf region. Saudi Aramco facilities, UAE terminals, Kuwaiti refineries. The kind of strike that would not merely push Brent to $100 but potentially to levels that would shatter the global economy. What makes this phase of the crisis categorically more dangerous than the opening weeks is the exhaustion of every available economic shock absorber. In the spring, when the strait first closed and global oil supply fell by approximately 4 million barrels per day, the international community mobilized an unprecedented emergency response. The International Energy Agency coordinated the largest emergency reserve release in its history, 400 million barrels drawn from member state strategic petroleum reserves and pushed onto the market to replace the missing Gulf supply. China simultaneously reduced its refinery run rates, leaning on its own domestically held stockpiles rather than competing for open market barrels. These interventions were painful, costly, and logistically complex, but they worked. They bought time. They kept the worst-case price spike from materializing. According to the IMF's most recent assessment, most of that cushion is now gone. Strategic petroleum reserves that took years to accumulate have been significantly drawn down. China's domestic stockpile buffer has been consumed. The spare capacity that the international oil market once held as insurance against exactly this kind of supply disruption has been deployed and spent. Prices remain well below the acute peak of the crisis, when Brent crude briefly approached $120 a barrel, but the market structure has fundamentally changed. Traders who once dismissed each new round of strikes as temporary noise are now building a permanent structural risk premium into forward curves that shows no sign of dissipating. If the strait remains this restricted for another 2 to 4 weeks, the next price shock will arrive without any of the institutional machinery that absorbed the last one. There are no more reserve drawdowns to authorize. There is no more Chinese buffer to release. There is no diplomatic track that is clearly functioning. This is not the first time American presidents have ordered the Navy into these waters in response to Iranian maritime aggression. In 1987 and 1988, the United States ran Operation Earnest Will, a sustained campaign to escort Kuwaiti tankers through the Persian Gulf under American flags, protecting them from Iranian attack. That operation triggered its own wave of congressional hearings, its own succession of naval engagements, and eventually culminated in Operation Praying Mantis on April 18, 1988, to this day, the largest surface naval engagement the U.S. Navy has fought since the end of the Second World War. In a single day of combat, American forces sank or disabled half of Iran's operational naval fleet. The parallels are not lost on anyone briefing lawmakers on Capitol Hill this month. The Congressional Research Service flagged the Strait of Hormuz as a standing strategic risk in a Senate confirmation hearing as recently as June 2025, warning specifically that any prolonged closure would translate directly into higher gasoline and diesel prices for American consumers, a political feedback loop that no White House can ignore indefinitely. There is no victory lap here, no ceasefire holding, no breakthrough emerging from any back channel. Just another operational update posted to a government social media account, another wave of strikes completed, another countdown beginning to whatever Tehran decides to do before sunrise, and gas prices at the pump creeping upward with every post. This is a live conflict. It is unresolved. The decisions made in the next 72 hours in the Oval Office, in Tehran's Supreme National Security Council, in the combat information centers of U.S. Navy warships currently holding firing solutions on Iranian coastal targets will determine whether this crisis finds a floor or continues to escalate towards something that the global energy system and the broader international order is genuinely not prepared to absorb. What happens next in the Strait of Hormuz will shape oil markets, global shipping routes, and regional stability for months, possibly years to come. Stay with verified sources. This story is still being written in real time. And ask yourself this: at what point does calibrated pressure become the kind of all-out campaign that no one in Washington, in Tehran, or anywhere in between actually knows how to stop?